Hi, I'm Matthew Miller, and I chose to do my New Testament textual analysis over the Isaianic influence in the book of Mark. I've devoted a considerable amount of time studying the book of Mark over the past couple of years, being that I chose to write my thesis over the longer ending, which I'll get to a little bit later in this presentation. But it's clear that Isaiah is not the only Hebrew Bible influence within the book of Mark. However, that being said, Isaiah, and especially Isaiah's New Exodus, seems to form an important paradigm through which Mark understands the Christ event. And so when looking at it, there are three key texts that I utilize to understand, obviously, as the assignment called for. I began with Richard B. Hayes' book, Reading Backwards, and how he read Mark, and we'll look at that in just a second. Also utilized the intertextual method of Steve Moise, and how we'll look at explicit quotation, we'll look at the narrative pattern, and also allusions to the Isaianic passages in Isaiah, especially Isaiah chapters 40 through 55. And when I say I utilize Steve Moise, his method is called dialogical intertextuality, and what that means is that he believes that there's a dynamic interplay within the text, that when a text utilizes a scripture from prior, so we're talking about Mark utilizing Isaiah, that it retains some form of that meaning while also taking on a renewed meaning, as Hayes points out. There's a third text that I use to help in my understanding, and it's a book written by Ricky Watts, sort of groundbreaking work on Isaiah's New Exodus and Mark. And each of these texts complemented one another in understanding how Isaiah is utilized within the Markan writings. And so there are three different sections of Mark that I want to look at. The first section, and each correspond to these different intertextual plays that are happening. The first is an explicit quotation that we see at the very beginning of Mark, and the second is going to be the narrative pattern, and then the third will be an allusion that will come from the long ending of Mark. And so I want to go ahead and look at those passages now. The first is an explicit quotation, and it comes from Mark chapter 1, and we see the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Now, it's clear that although Mark is attributing this entire corpus here, this entire pericope to Isaiah, that there are various texts that are playing into this. Malachi comes into play. Primarily, this comes from Isaiah 40. But this Isaiah 40 comes from a passage in the book of Exodus. And so when we look at this, we see at the very outset that Mark is very concerned with the messianic secret, that all throughout the text that there is sort of this underlying question of who is the Christ. And Mark doesn't come out and exactly say it like John does, for instance, but through his utilization of Isaiah and other Hebrew Bible passages, he gives, and Hayes points that out very well, that Mark demonstrates through the allusions, through the narrative patterns, through the quotations, through the parables, through these different narrative factors, that he demonstrates how Isaiah is forming the Markan text. And so here we see from the very beginning, I think, in my understanding, that Mark is telling us something very important on how he is interpreting the scriptures, how he's utilizing them, that he is utilizing them to explain who Christ is, the events surrounding his arrival in the narrative, and also explaining what the mission is already right here, because we see here that he doesn't say that he is God, but he says, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, I send my messenger before your face who will prepare the way, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. And we know that from Isaiah that Lord here is Yahweh. And then we see John appear on the scene, and he is preparing the way for Yahweh. But we know, reading further, that he's preparing the way for Christ. And so, though he doesn't come straight out and say that, he is utilizing this passage here to set the paradigm for understanding who Jesus is. And it is already alluded to here in this passage through this quotation. So here we have an explicit quotation where he comes right out and says, it is written in Isaiah the prophet. Now I want to look at the narrative framework that Mark utilizes. A very important image of God throughout the book of Isaiah, and especially the passages concerning the Isaianic New Exodus, is that Yahweh is a warrior, a deliverer, and he delivers the people from their idolatry. And as we go through Mark, and I want to read a couple selections from Ricky Watt's book, Isaiah's New Exodus and Mark. We see that Mark is framing Jesus as the Yahweh warrior deliverer. And I want to read a couple sections of this where he explains this. The first, he's talking about the ultimate oppressors. And again, idolatry is looked at as the oppressors, the nations, Babylon, which is what Isaiah 40 through 55 talks about, the Babylonian exile. And so they utilize this language from Isaiah to explain Jesus' mission, that Jesus is dealing with the idolatry of the nations, but more than that, he's dealing with the root cause of the idolatry, and that's the demons. And so all throughout the book of Mark, we see that Jesus is dealing with lots of healings, and he's also dealing with lots of demoniacs. And so here, Ricky Watts writes about this literary scheme, that the observation, and he's talking about Mark chapter 5, he says that the observation that the destruction of the demons in Mark 5 reflects the fulfillment of the demons' question in 1:24, highlights the relationship between the three accounts. It should be noted that these are the only detailed references to Jesus' encounters with the demonic in the first section. Jesus' first authoritative confrontation presages the coming destruction of the demonic forces, while the second explains both Jesus' actions and the source of his authority in terms of the Isaianic Yahweh warrior. And then he goes on to associate this with how Mark utilizes euangelion and euangelizo. And he says, with this overall scheme of Jesus as the Yahweh warrior in mind, and in view of the importance of euangelion in 1:1, it may not be insignificant that several of the religious uses of euangelizo in the Septuagint involve this motif. And he quotes some passages from Psalm 67, 95, and Nahum 1:15, but then goes on to demonstrate that in Isaiah chapter 40 and 52 and 61, it says that the Septuagint's use of the verb, he's talking about euangelizo, in these contexts appears not only to involve deliverance, but associates the actions of the Yahweh warrior in overcoming the nation's demonic gods. This is entirely compatible with its use in Isaiah 40 verse 9, 52 verse 7, and 61:1. And then he says, finally, if, as is commonly held, Mark presents Jesus in eschatological conflict with Satan and his demons, and if euangelion, understood as the content of euangelizo, relates to the promised deliverance of God's people, whence the antecedent? Surely the most obvious precursor is the general motif expressed throughout the Old Testament of Yahweh's battles with the nations and their idols. And so, again, that was sort of a lengthy reading, but I think he makes some really good arguments that the narrative framework of the book of Mark is demonstrative of the fact that all these cosmic conflicts that Christ has with the demons, with Satan, is representative of the Yahweh warriors' conflicts with the idolatry of the nations. And then last, I said I wanted to talk about the long ending of Mark. And again, I don't have time, and it's beyond the scope to discuss the text critical issues, the authenticity of the long ending, but I think that it's an important conclusion to the Isaianic hopes of the book of Mark. And one of the ways that this is worked out is through after the commission, where the disciples are told to proclaim the gospel to the entire creation, the entire created order, ktisis. He says these signs will accompany, and he's playing. He even talks about picking up a serpent, and I don't believe that means that we as disciples are meant to handle serpents as the Appalachian tradition is. However, I think he's playing on an allusion to Isaiah chapter 11. And here in Isaiah chapter 11, we read that in verse 6, the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. It's very clear that this is an eschatological expectation of Isaiah that goes all the way throughout Isaiah 55, Isaiah 65. And so what we see here is that Mark, or the long ending of Mark, rather, is playing on this, alluding to this text where there's a reversal in the cosmic curse that is taking place within the created order. And that with this reversal, there's an association of this reversal with the proclamation of the gospel, of the good news, of the evangelion. And so it seems like an appropriate conclusion to the Isaianic hopes, especially the New Exodus hopes of the book of Mark. And so I know I went a little over time, but I hope that you get a little something from my analysis. I look forward to hearing everyone else's. And thanks for your time. God bless. Have a great day.